The Whitby Historical Society respectfully acknowledges that the Lynde House Museum, the Warren General Store, and Clarissa Lynde's Heritage Gardens are situated on the traditional territories of the Mississauga of Scugog Islands First Nations, and we acknowledge and support the First Nations as stewards and caretakers of these lands and waters in perpetuity. We continue to support them on a path toward truth and reconciliation.
My name is Lynn Hodgson, and this is my wife, Marlene. We've been married for 57 years, and we actually started out in Whitby many years ago, about 45 years ago. And from there, I'll let Marlene tell you about how we got involved in this trip along the road to Camp X.
Well, it started a weekend. We were living in Whitby on Shannon Court, just behind Henry Street High School. And Lynn had been traveling, and he was very tired. And so we were in the backyard, and I was reading a book called A Man Called Intrepid. And I got to the page, and he's laying back, just soaking up the sun. And I said to him, I think it's around here. And the smartest thing that man ever said was, "What, dear?" And I'm reading about this camp, this during World War II that was located Whitby, Oshawa, and they say the land was CBC was owned the land, and there was communications, and West Lynde was a brand new subdivision. So I thought, wouldn't it be really wild if this camp I'm reading about was right here where I'm living? So then a neighbor, Alan Longfield, was also reading the book. And one Sunday afternoon, we threw the kids in the car and we said, let's go find this place. And that is how we found Camp X and started a journey, as I said, 45 years. And the places that we've been to, the people we've met, it has been such an absolute adventure. Wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Camp X was a World War II secret agent spy school on the shores of Lake Ontario. It was opened on December the 6th, 1941. Its purpose was to train secret agents to go in behind enemy lines. Everything that they had there was for the purpose of developing a secret agent to survive behind enemy lines. So the part of the training, for example, of an agent would be map reading, how to live in the woods, how to survive in the woods, what things could you eat, that type of thing. They also had small arms weaponry training, Sten guns, Bren guns. They had Morse code training, of course. They had explosives training. So anything went on this journey, including assassination. So everything between secret agents, spying, sabotage, and assassination. The reason why we knew we had found Camp X was, first of all, Bill Hardcastle, of course, who lived down at the bottom of Thixon Point. He built a house there after the war, after the camp closed down in 1969. He and Bernie Sandbrook, who were both hams in the Hydra operations, built this house over on Thixon Point. right down by the lake. And so he pointed us in the direction of where we would find the camp. After that, we met up with Andy Durovitz, who was a Hungarian-Canadian agent who was trained at Camp X, went behind enemy lines on his mission, secret mission, and we took him back to the camp with us. And he identified where things were. And at that time, the original foundations of all the buildings were still there. The old Sinclair farmhouse roadway was still there. The circle at the end of the roadway was there where the house was. And all the foundations, as I said, of the various buildings. So from photographs, I was able to identify all of those buildings. And then I was also able to measure them and determine the exact size of each building and exactly where it was situated. We found a lot of artifacts down along the beach, most of them, and that's because they had a dump. And the dump was right at the bottom of Thornton Road. And back in those days, you just threw things over the bluffs. That's what you did. Of course, everything would just build up over time of the lifespan of the camp. And then years later, when you would have a storm, such as the remnants of a hurricane, large waves, and we're talking about some of them 6 feet, 9 feet high, would come in and bash against the bluffs where the dump was. And so it would pull things out of the dump back into the lake. And then, of course, the next storm would come along and throw it back up on the lake. So every time there was a storm, we would go down to the lake and walk along the stones and look down, of course. And the very first thing I found was that woman's brass lipstick container that you have in the exhibit. While we were walking around the camp and excavating, even though we weren't qualified to do it, we were doing archaeological digs. This was 1970. Yeah, around 76 was the first time we found it, the very first time. And then 77, 78, 79, 80, we did most of our exploring and whatnot. But I thought to myself, I can't believe that no one is doing anything in terms of research relative to the camp. And at that point, I thought to myself, I'm going to write a book about this once I finish. And then I'm going to call it Inside Camp X. I often say when I'm speaking to people about the subject that I had to become a writer, I had to become a researcher, I had to become an investigator,
Historian.
I had to become a historian. All these different things you had to become to get to the story.
Bill Hardcastle. He was our number one. We got Bill to trust us enough to start talking. And we built up a relationship with him. And what we have found that everybody at the camp always stayed in touch with one more person. So Bill said, well, you really should talk to Bernie. And then Bernie said, well, Mac just lives over in Bowmanville. So we started bringing in this nucleus of friends that have stayed close. And then the local press picked up on what we were doing. And we started getting some press, and also the Sun and Toronto Star picked up and Andy Durovitz got in touch with us. He found us. And he said, if you want to know what happened in the camp, I can tell you because I was trained there. And I had a wonderful relationship. We had a great relationship with Andy. He was a very sweet man who could kill you. But he was our first. And then Lynn, being the gentleman that he is and that he won't take no for an answer, he picked up the phone and called Sir William Stevenson in Bermuda. And he answered his call. And they would speak about every second or third Sunday. And Lynn would ask questions. And Sir William would either answer or not answer. And Sir William Stevenson was one of the first people who have investigated us. We have been vetted and investigated for so many years. And Sir William, Lynn said, I want to tell the story of the men and women of Camp X. And so Sir William backed us and opened doors that never would have been opened without his okay.
And the other thing we used to do is on a Sunday, we would invite Andy Durovitz over, Bill Hardcastle, and Mac McDonald, the first guard at the camp. And Bill's nickname was Yorkie because he was from Yorkshire. And so I surreptitiously would make sure that I made things that would fit into the conversation. So I made roast beef, roasted potatoes, and Yorkshire pudding, of course. So I would say to Bill, how do you like your Yorkshire pudding? Do you like the small round Yorkshires, or do you like the big slab that fits on a plate? He says, well, I usually have the slab that fits all over the plate, and then I put everything on top of it. I said, okay, well, that's what I've got. So that opened up the door for us to get into discussions about, what did you do at the camp and that kind of thing. Or do you have any stories? And in my book, Inside Camp X, I have a lot of those stories, and those stories were told to us personally by the three of them, or even more than that for that matter, because we did meet many more after that. But we had a committee back then. It was called the Camp X Museum Society. And somewhere in our conversations of our meetings, we came up with the idea of having a reunion. We certainly had enough people to come to this reunion. And at that same time, there was a guy named Lancaster. He was a reporter with the Toronto Star. Globe and Mail? Oh, that's right. It was a Globe and Mail. And because Bill worked for the Star. So he was a reporter. He wrote a story about Eric Kerwayne. Eric Kerwayne being the chief recruitment officer for Camp X, one of the top guys, and good friend of ours, very good friend of ours. And so he came to this reunion that we had. We had the reunion in the old Quonset hut at the Oshawa Airport, which was Bob Stewart's museum, and it dated back to World War II, the Quonset hut. So it was a very appropriate place to have the reunion. Many of the staff were there. Many of the agents were there. And I found out the next day, because it was a secret, that Igor Guzenko was there, the Russian spy who started the whole Cold War between the Russians and the West. The reason why he was there was because he had an attachment to Camp X. He was there in 1945 and 1946 under protective custody. So it was a great evening that we had overall, and everybody came.
And we also had the BSC ladies, which was the British Security Coordination ladies, that Canadians that were hired to work in New York with Sir William, because at the time the U.S. was neutral, and Roosevelt would have been impeached if they found out exactly how involved he was. So what Sir William did through Eric Kerwayne was he recruited all these young women from across Canada to come and work with Sir William and the BSC in New York. And they would have a reunion every year. So we were fortunate enough that they would invite us to their luncheon. And then in turn, when we had our reunion, we invited them to come and see the people that they had worked with. They had never seen them, I remember you. They never actually met in person, but had been working together.
The most favorite part of this whole setup and operation and our time involved in this, and our excursion and where it took us and whatnot, was all the things that we were able to accomplish and do that we would never have been able to do if we hadn't found Camp X in the first place. I mean, it took us on a journey. It took us to England twice. It took us to Bletchley Park, the Bletchley Park Manor, where I was able to speak to the Senate itself. It took me to the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, where in 2002, I was the only Canadian that was invited to the OSS, the 60th anniversary reunion of the OSS. So all the places where it's taken us, and then it evolved into present time, where all of our major intelligence operations of today, to intelligence, CSE, CSE, CSIS, JTF2, JTFX, all of those organizations were born out of Camp X. And it's just now that they completely recognize that their operations were born out of Camp X. And so they've all had me in various times to lecture the graduating classes of agents of today, I'll call them, doing the same kind of work behind enemy lines surreptitiously. And they included Marlene in all of that. She was invited and attended many times. We stayed in the commandant's residence at JTF2. It just all the places that we've been to and all the things that have opened up was probably, our greatest accomplishment.
Well, the one of the hallmarks was when we were invited to go to the opening of the Sir William Stevenson building at JTFX. We're the only two civilians that have ever been to a graduating class. Not their parents don't go, no one from the outside, but Lynn and I were the only two outsiders that were there at the graduation, and we got a grand tour of the building and all the things that are happening today. Camp X was yesterday, but it's still going on today.
Created a museum for them at their home in Ottawa. This is JTFX now, and so they have an exhibit that we built for them of artifacts, and then at the other locations, I've given them copies of the BSC Bible that's here on display in the Whitby Library and Oshawa Library. So they've all got copies of that as well on display, and it's pretty neat to see.
And when you go into the officers' mess in JTFX in Ottawa, and just as you're entering the officers' mess is a big picture of the cover of Inside Camp X. And so
that's JTF2.
JTF2,
yeah.
Yes. The alphabet.
Yeah.
And it's just, we're working, even today, we're working with the men and women that are active today.
We just, as you know, with a team of other individuals that live in Whitby, Sue Green, and for example, and the mayor created the Intrepid statue, which is outside of the Whitby Library. And, that was a fundraising thing where we raised $180,000 from the public. And that's now up and being visited by a lot of people. We just, in fact, we're going down next Thursday to Casa Loma again, where we've just concluded and built a museum on the third floor, a huge room of artifacts. All my main Camp X artifacts are all in there. And two intelligence company have their museum in there as well with our Camp X stuff. The Hydra building, during the war, it was in a shack that I call the Radio Shack. It was a very small building, but it was the Hydra radio station, and the most powerful radio in the world at the time. It stayed active all during the war, but at the end of the war, the equipment itself was still state of the art, so they kept it. But the British moved out, of course, because the war was over. They went back home, and then everyone said, "Well, what do we do with this building, and what do we do with the other buildings and the rest of the property?" So Sir William Stevenson made an argument to the Canadian government and the DND that there was still a need for an intelligence organization in Canada. So he argued that they should continue on, even though the war was over, they should continue on with what they were doing. They allowed him to do that until 1946. And in 1946, they said, no, that's it. You're finished. Move out. So he retired. He went to Bermuda, retired in Bermuda. And the Canadian government turned the property over to the town of Whitby. The town of Whitby said, well, we really don't have any use for it, but we'll make a small park out of it. Well, in 1946, when they did leave, ultimately, the signals, a Corps of Signals, Canadian Corps of Signals, said, we'll take it. So they came in and continued to operate it, and that's what turned into our CSE today, which is the communications establishment in Ottawa. And so they erected a new building, a new Hydra building, made of concrete. And you have to remember, this was during the Cold War with the Russians. So the building was 1 story underground and 2 stories above ground. And the entire building was made of 4 feet thick of concrete, made to withstand a nuclear blast because of the importance of the building and the equipment that was still being used all during the Cold War with the Russians. So just a year ago now or something like that, I was notified about some drawings that had been found in one of the homes in Whitby, and I know you had Brian Winter in to take a look at them, and Brian said, I think it's Camp X, but you better ask Lynn Hodgson, and you had me come down and laid them out, and sure enough, it was very obvious to me on the first viewing of the drawings that it definitely was the Hydra operation, because the very first drawing that I saw showed an overview of all the buildings, and then the Hydra building in the center, and then the drawings went through from there. And of course, they would have built the Hydra up right after the drawings were completed. They would have started construction on it. So construction probably took them a year or so. But it was certainly a significant find for the museum.
During the 50s, you used to have in school, you would have duck and cover where you would get under your desk. And I'm thinking, why are we doing this? It's so stupid. I mean, what are they going to do? Drop a nuclear bomb on us and, maybe kill a cow? Because it was a very rural area at the time. And then with the research, found out that we were one of the top 10 targets for the Russians during the Cold War, because in a time of war, you take out communications. And the Hydra building was the elite of communications.
So Bletchley Park itself, we've been there twice. The first time we were there, I was invited to speak to the Bletchley Park Trust about Camp X and about the link to Bletchley Park, obviously, the association between the Hydra operation and Bletchley. As part of that, we had a private tour of the entire place. We went into places that you would normally, the public wouldn't be open to it. There was a large room above the manor, and actually the dome of it is made of copper, and that's because it's a conductor. But at that time, they found all kinds of secret rooms that they didn't know about. So we were given all of these different tours and played on the radios. I listened to Russian traffic in where Baltic Sea or somewhere like that, and in Morse code, of course. We were able to go over to another hut where we played on the Enigma machine, the two of us coding back and forth, and how that whole thing worked. What else did we do?
We got to meet a lot of people. They just opened up their hearts and their homes to us. And David White was the curator, the one man that Lynn didn't know, but he was being vetted by David. And obviously he passed the test, because that is why we got to go to places that the normal public wouldn't get. But the interesting part was that David White was the receiver in Bletchley Park. Bill Hardcastle was the sender at Hydra at Camp X. And they'd never met, and everything was in code. And when David was talking, the thing I remember about him mostly was he would say, "Oh yes, I used to speak to Oshawa on a regular basis." And Oshawa, "Oh, you mean Oshawa?" And he said, "Well, isn't that that's how you pronounce it?" And I said, "You only saw it written, you never heard it spoken, but it's Oshawa, not Oshawa."
Well, there's a lot of things that are obviously still covered by the Official Secrets Act. Most of what was released in 19. I picked up most of my stuff back in 1977, 78, somewhere around there. But everything that went on from 1946 to 1969 is still covered under the Official Secrets Act and has not been published. I know a lot of things that went on, but that's only because of interviews that I did with Bill Hardcastle, for example, was there for 26 years, the entire time, right from the beginning of the war until it closed down in 1969. So he obviously knew a lot. And so there's a lot of things that did go on there after the war and through the Cold War. It actually the Hydra operation played a very important part in the Cold War, spying on the Russians. One of the things I can tell you that they did right off the bat is, you know how they would send the Russians, Czechoslovakia, for example, when they occupied Czechoslovakia, they would send propaganda into Czechoslovakia over the radio. And of course, you'd be listening to the radio and you would hear all this propaganda coming in, and it was just a daily routine. Well, the Hydra operation would play music, and that's how strong a signal they had. They would play music in Czechoslovakia over top of the Russian propaganda, so they would drown out the Russian propaganda. And that was just a typical Cold War thing that went on all the time. But there were many other things that went on at the camp through that period until 1969. Tony Johnson, yeah. So he was the painter of the mural, and Tony contacted me and said, "What do you think about this idea?" And I said, "Great idea." And he said, "Well, what should I include in it?" So I gave him a bunch of ideas as to what to put into this mural he was going to. And I said, "Well, how much room do you have?" And he said, "Well, it's the whole side of the PUC building, downtown Oshawa." And so I said, "Okay, well." So anyway, Bill Hardcastle, of course, there's a photograph of Bill working his radio before the war, and of course that's in there. And so he picked up all these little pieces of interesting things about the Sinclair farmhouse, the property itself, the training that went on. Churchill, the tiger moth from Oshawa Airport. He put all these things in that mural, and I'm really surprised that nobody has ever touched it. I really am, because that's the first thing I thought would happen to it, right? But no one has ever touched it, which is a credit to everybody that lives in the area, that it has never been damaged in any way. But yeah, so now you can tell the story about Bill visiting.
Bill was he was a very quiet man. He only spoke when he had something to say. And so we told him about the mural, and every morning he would take his lawn chair and a Tim Hortons coffee, and he would sit and watch Tony paint the mural. So when it was finished, Bill, in his quiet way, walked up and said, "My hair wasn't that color." So Tony was very sweet and understanding and changed his hair color. And when Bill passed away, 2002, his service was at the McIntosh Anderson Funeral Home, and a friend of ours, Brian Goff, had a World War II Jeep. So what we did is we put Bill's ashes on the back of a World War II Jeep. And we did a tour. From the funeral home, we went down and slowly past the mural, stopping in front of Bill's picture, and then proceeded down Simcoe Street. And Bill's ashes are buried at the base of the memorial under the Union Jack, because he said that is the flag that we fought under. And his remains are buried at the base of the Union Jack, and there was a plaque of Bill's. But it was, we always said we brought Bill back to camp.
Well, one of the most influential people, in my opinion, in Whitby, who has not got the credit he deserves, is Lynn Hodgson. He's been working since 1977 to uncover the history of Camp X. And it really is a case of uncovering. And he's actually worked with Bletchley Park and some of the people that were involved with Camp X in the war, and written about more than a dozen books on the history of Camp X and related activities in World War II in this area. And he's tried to get a museum established. He does have a display at Castle Loma now on Camp X, but his books are the most important thing. He did all the research for them, and there's one story that there was a man named Tommy Drew Brooke who was the sort of a facilitator for Sir William Stevenson in buying the land for Camp X and setting up the camp. And Lynn had an interview with him 6 days before he died. So he just managed to get the information in time. And he's met numerous people who were willing to talk about Camp X. One was a man named Bill Hardcastle, who lived in Whitby all his life, and actually was one of the last employees at Camp X after it closed. And one by one, they gradually got to trust him, and he bought these stories that they were willing to tell. And they're all in the books.
After my book came out, after all the publicity that was out there, newspaper articles being written, stories being told, the camp itself became very popular. And you'll hear people say today, it's a shame what they did with that camp. They should have turned it into a museum or something. You'll hear that all the time. But of course, it was too late. It was gone. No one knew at the time, shortly after the camp closed, the significance of the camp. So, but the politicians, we went at our society, the Camp X Museum Society, went out after all of the politicians to do something for the camp and the recognition of it. And we had the backing of Sir William Stevenson, of course. And so one of the fellows that was involved in our organization was a member of Parliament. His name was Affleck, I think it was. Bruce Affleck, yeah. And he was on our committee. And so he went after the government of the day and said, look, I need some money to recognize Camp X. So they came forward with the monies to build the cairn and opened it in, I think it was, 1986? I think it was dedicated.
Yes, 84, 86, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I think it was 86. And so it was a big event. The lieutenant, what are they called? Lieutenant...
Governor General?
Governor General. And anyway, her name was Gubbins, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And
Pauline McGummon.
McGummon, yeah. She was there. And a number of the local politicians and whatnot were there. Many of the men and women of Camp X were there. Bernie was there, of course. Bill Hardcastle was there. And so it was a nice dedication that we had. And then after that, I started doing tours of Camp X. I did a lot of schools, had a lot of schools go through there. And then I started doing my tours on my own, and then Doors Open came along, both Whitby and Oshawa, and asked me if I would do them as part of Doors Open. And I said, absolutely. So for many years, we did the Doors Open as well. And then just, 2 years ago, I think it was, or maybe 3 now, the Canadian government, the federal government, recognized it as a National Historic site. So there's another huge plaque there recognizing it today as a National Historic site. So it's now finally receiving a lot of recognition.
And Bernie Sandbrook and Bill Hardcastle were the ones that chose the location, because where the monument is right smack dab over the Hydra building.
In fact, the Hydra building is still underneath where the cairn is.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's been such an adventure that it's the people and the men and women, because that's what we promised. Eric Kerwayne and Andy Dervitz tried to tell their story and get their books published, but nobody would touch them. So Lynn said, "I will tell your story," and nobody. He put his book out to different publishers, and nobody was interested. They said there wasn't enough American content in it, so they didn't want it. And so Lynn had made a promise that he would tell the story, so we became self-published. So it's been a real mom and pop operation. We go out together, promoting the education of people about Camp X. But the best part that we enjoy is when we teach the students that Canada has heroes. Canada has history. You don't have to rely on anybody else to find a hero.
Well, I would have to say my best artifact that I have, and I should say artifacts, are a series of what's called challenge coins. Now, anyone that's in the military will know what you're talking about when you say challenge coin. Many people in the public general would not know what you're talking about. But a challenge coin, and this is a challenge coin. This particular challenge coin says Joint Task Force 2, and it has their logo on it, and it has their motto, of course, on the back. But this is the organization that are what I call Camp X agents of today. These are the guys that are special ops. They go in behind enemy lines. They're hit and run people, where they go in on a specific mission. It's fast, it's quick, and they're back out. And those missions take place all the time. But the places where we've gone and the people that we've met over the years, I've amassed a collection of these coins. And the greatest pleasure is the fact that, an accomplishment, is the fact that many of these coins have a number on the back, a serial number. So 127 is my number, for example. And on that particular coin, if you go to their headquarters, which you really can't do because it's not open to the public, it's closed. But if you were to get in there, you would find a binder, and in that binder would be a list of coins that have been given out to people over the years. Most of them are given out for their service, for some type of accomplishment, right, within their ranks. And my number is number 127. So if you were to look in that book, you would see my name and you would see 127. That coin belongs to me. Well, I have a whole collection of these from various organizations, British, American, Canadian, and most, like many of the coins would be stamped with my number on it. So unfortunately, it's something that I can't share. I can't share with anyone. I can't post it to social media because of the secrecy of the organization itself. But anyway, it's something that I have that I guess I'd have to say I cherish, right? It's so easy for someone to say that never happened. And when someone says that to me, and I have 10,000 documents in my archives, and everything that I've ever published or written can be backed up by declassified top secret documents. So when someone says to me, well, you said this in your book, but that didn't happen, I automatically say to them, well, I'll tell you what, you bring your 3 facts of proof that it did not happen, and I'll bring my 3. And if your 3 outweighs my 3, we're going with your story. Oh, well, I don't have any proof or anything. I just know it didn't happen. Okay, story closed. Ian Fleming was at Camp X in 1943 with a group of his agents who were called 30 AU. 30 AU is 30 Assault Unit. These agents worked for him. And what they were is they were actually what we would call Navy SEAL today. Now, as you know, Lake Ontario, the only time you can go into Lake Ontario is in August when it warms up a bit. Any other time, it's just too cold. So he was here in the summer of 1943 in August with his group. And what they were doing is they had one-man subs. And they actually had a large block, concrete block off the coast of Camp X, right down at the beach. And it had a large iron hook in it. And they would moor a freighter to it. So the one-man sub agents would go out and they would put limpet mines underneath the freighter. So this was practice for them. And they actually did this kind of thing in the Dieppe raid before that. And of course, they were going to be involved in D-Day as well, doing the same kind of things. What I did was I amassed a number of things through research that proved that he was there. Ian Fleming was there. And so, for example, if you look at some of the on YouTube, some of the BBC and some of the CBC interviews, Ian Fleming talks about his time in Canada. And he even gets to the point where he says, well, I really can't talk about what I was doing there because it's still, he said, I'll get into trouble with the Official Secrets Act. And what he meant by that was basically they were always threatened that if they were to talk about what they did during the war, their pension would be cut off. The very first thing that would happen. They didn't want that to happen. So I amassed a number of interviews and a number of pieces that I took out of books that were written where individuals talked about his relationship with William Stevenson in New York. Marlene can tell you a story about one of the BSC ladies. Actually, she was Moneypenny.
Yeah.
She was Moneypenny.
Yeah. She was the inspiration.
Right. So many of these stories that were in his books and in his movies really happened, but they're put forward as fiction.
When we would go to the BSC ladies' luncheon reunion, there was a beautiful lady. Her name was Charmaine. And she I remember her because she lived up to her name. She was so regal. Mm-hmm. And when I asked her, was Ian Fleming ever at Camp X? And she said, yes, Ian was at Camp X because I arranged his travel. I bought the train tickets. Then fast forward a few years, we met another lady. Her name was Sybil McClure. And we asked her, was Ian Fleming at Camp X? And she said, yes, of course he was. I was his driver. Sybil was at Camp X. She was the driver. And she said, oh, yeah, he was there all the time. And another thing that to get Ian Fleming, one of the instructors at Camp X was a guy named Paul Dane. Paul Dane was a screenplay writer. He went on to write screenplays. And one of them we have a letter from Paul Dane he had a pen pal here in Whitby that he kept. And he said, I'm working on this strangest screenplay. And he said, it's really strange. It's either going to be a great hit or it's going to be a great flop. And that was Planet of the Apes. With Paul Dane, you have to look at the subliminal. While everybody's looking at the forefront, when we watch a James Bond movie, we look at the background. So if you take out the video of Escape from the Planet of the Apes, there's a part where the female ape has been captured and she's going for interrogation at this special camp, Camp 11. So as in the film, as they're driving into this special camp, the camera goes to the rear mirror of the car. And as the gate closes on Camp 11, it says Camp X, Roman numerals X1, but you don't see the 1, you just see Camp X.
Paul Dane was the political warfare executive instructor. So political warfare was how to fight the war with your mind and not weapons. And I've always said I liken it to playing chess because you have to be 3 moves ahead of your opponent at any given time. So they didn't have a lot of instructors there. They had a dozen or so, but they were all officers. So they had an officers' mess at the camp. And obviously, in August, when Ian Fleming was there, they would get together for a few beers in the evening and talk about what they'd been doing during the war, what they're going to do before, or what they did before the war, and what they're going to do after the war. And so obviously they befriended each other, Ian Fleming and Paul Dane, because in the movie Goldfinger, when that finally came out, if you look at the back under the credits, you'll see that Paul Dane wrote the screenplay to the movie Goldfinger. So that was just another tie-in that proves that the two of them knew each other. But we have all his letters too.
Yes, we have his private letters.
Yeah, he wrote a number of letters. There was a woman that she had a farm just north of the camp, and Paul Dane, I've got photographs of her, and Paul Dane befriended her because they used to like to get away from the camp as much as they could, even just to go walking outside of the camp somewhere. And so I think her name was Aunt Floss was her name. Mm-hmm. And he wrote these letters back and forth in real time. And so I have all of those letters that he wrote. And he kept close contact with these people all through the years of his retirement back in England. 2013, Marlene and I were helping out some friends who had a fishing lodge up in Lake Nipissing. And in April of that year, we went up there and helped them prepare for the opening season. Her husband had brain cancer, and so she wasn't going to open the season at all. And we said, well, we'll come up and help you. So we went up and we actually stayed for 5 months and stayed in a little cabin. But while I was there, one of our jobs was to go over to the main lodge, and they had a store there where people could buy, milk, bread, eggs, that kind of thing. So we operated the little canteen. Well, one day I got a phone call, and it was from a producer named Stephanie Morgenstern. She introduced herself. She said I'm with the production company. They did Flashpoint, right? And they did a number of other things. And she said, we're looking at doing a series on Camp X. How do you think that would go over? And I said, I think it would be huge because I've been after Hollywood. I've been after all kinds of producers to do something to recognize Camp X and its accomplishments. So she said, well, I'm glad to hear that because we really want to pursue this. So she said, when are you back in the area? And I said, probably September. And she said, okay, I'll reach out to you in September. So we got back, and she did. She reached out to me and said that she would like to have a meeting with me. And so we got together, and she laid out the storyline for this series that was called X Company. And of course, the X stands for Camp X. But it was loosely built around the camp and the experiences of the camp and the agents and that type of thing. But this particular story was going to be about a woman who would become the leader of what was called Jedburghs, a team that goes in behind enemy lines and works together. Usually agents go on their own and they have their particular mission and they're on their own. But they did have Jedburgh teams like this as well. So she said, would you be willing to work with our writers? And I said, yeah, I'd love to. So I went over and I sat down. They had a place in Oakville. Sat down with the whole writing team. I think there were probably 10 of them. And I put on a presentation to them with a series of photographs that I have on my computer. And I projected it on the wall. And the idea was that they would take from that as many things as possible that were realistic of the period. So, for example, were they wearing when they were training as agents? Well, they wore these fatigues, right? And what would they wear behind enemy lines? And then what kind of uniforms were we dealing with? What was the training that took place? All of those things. And storylines. What was a typical mission? And the Dieppe raid was a good example, and that's one of the ones that they used. But in telling the stories of Camp X and the missions and the whole thing, they were able to put together a number of episodes that were actually based on world events, things that really happened. So when it evolved from that, it became very popular. I believe they had over 150,000 viewers per episode. They had 3 years of episodes. And I remember one time I got up in the morning, got on the computer, and I had an email there from Hungary. And there was an executive producer to the producer. And her job was to run around and put out fires. And she called me and she said, "Can I phone you right away? I need some information." So I said, "Yeah, but there's a big time difference here." I said, "I just got up." She said, "Okay, but I'll call you right now." So she called and she said, "We've got a Sherman, I think it was a Sherman tank, but we've got a tank anyway that is in one of these episodes, and they've got a question about the tank. Could it do this?" Right? And so I said, "Well, I'm not an expert in tanks, that's for sure, but I know somebody who is. That's the Ontario Regiment Tank Museum." Now I said, it's early, it's only 7:30 or something like that, so they might not be up yet, they might not be at work yet, but as soon as they are, I will get a hold of them, forward your question to them, and then get it right back to you. So I did that, and he had the right answer, of course, of what they were looking for. But that was very typical of some of the things that would happen. Stephanie would say to me, "Listen, we have a dilemma, and the problem is that we want Camp X to be involved, but Camp X is over here. The war is over there. And we want the agents going back to the camp after every mission because they're a team, right?" And I said, realistically, that never happened. Once they left the camp, they never saw it again until the day that Andy Durovitz went around with us and walked through the camp again. But I said that never happened. But I said, you have to take certain liberties. If you're going to include the camp, you've got to include the camp. So they did that. They took that one liberty. And then another time they called me and they said, "What would be on the walls?" And I said, there was a calendar and there was a board. And the board had the names of the people who were on shift that day in whatever department it was, Hydra, communications, etc. And they said, "That's it? Nothing about missions?" And absolutely not. Everybody that worked in Camp X, they had their own little area, and they never got They never left that area. And they never were able to ask questions about your area or my area. So I said that was all part of the secrecy side of this thing and keeping it. That's why when you investigate something like this and you talk to everybody that was involved, you get the whole picture. And that's why one person might say, well, I don't remember that ever happening. Well, that's because you weren't allowed to know. This person was allowed to know. So that was very typical of that. So so X Company was great working on it. It was very popular, 3 seasons. I believe it was 8 episodes of an hour long, each one, and extremely well done, even though they did have to take liberties.
And it went to Netflix.
It's on Netflix. It's on a lot of the major networks too. It was very popular. It went right around the world. It was in England. It was in Australia. It was very big in South America because people were contacting me all the time, wanting to know more about it. How can I view it? That kind of thing. CBC, cbc.ca/X Company. It's all the episodes are still up there today, and you can view them free of charge.
Lynn and Marlene's contribution to preserving Whitby's history is so immense. The fact that they managed to collect the stories about Camp X directly from the people who were there is an incredible achievement, because if they had not done what they did when they did it, those stories would be lost forever. People love the Camp X display here at the museum. They still buy copies of Lynn's book. The education continues because as new generations come along, as new people move to Whitby, there's still people learning about this very important part of our history. And if it wasn't for Lynn and Marlene, nobody would know. So we've really got to be thankful for the dedication that they put towards preserving our history.
When I wrote Inside Camp X back in 1999, it was published in 99. I started writing it in 97. After it was published, I got into a lot of trouble with the RCMP. I got in trouble way back in the 70s with the RCMP when I was doing the research. But when I published it, I had to make a choice. I either go to them with it and say, here's what I've done, and I'd like permission to print it, or I just go ahead and print it. So I went ahead and printed it. And it was so popular, it spread so quickly that there wasn't anything they could do about it. So finally, a little while later, a few months later, after it had sold probably 20,000 copies by then, CSIS called me and said, by the way, your book's okay. So I wasn't really worried about it, because what are they going to do? Lock me up for a year? Big deal. So anyway, but because I got into so much trouble over that, the next book I had a lot of things in it that would have put me right back into trouble again. So I said, I'm not going to do it this time as a nonfiction. I'm going to do it as faction. Fiction built around fact. So that when they read the book, they won't be able to tell what's fiction and what's fact. Therefore, the whole book is fiction. But it included many, many facts that were factual events that happened. And the book was called The Final Battle. And I wrote a sequel to it, which was called Camp X Silver Dagger. For example, one of the things that was in there that was factual was the assassination of an Italian agent who managed to infiltrate himself into Camp X. And the chief instructor of the camp suspected this and went to the commandant and told him the story of what this guy was doing. And they followed him, by the way. They followed him to meetings that he had with the Germans, handlers, in the Toronto area. And so the colonel said to the chief instructor, listen, I don't care what happens, and I don't want to know about it. And so that was an okay to go ahead and do whatever you're thinking about doing. So he was actually through a whole series of schemes they came up with. He was assassinated in the Janasha Hotel in Oshawa. in room 301. It was funny because after my book came out, I got a call from a lady, and she said, "Thank you very much. I just want to thank you." And I said, "What's that for?" And she said, "I live in room 301 of the Janasha Hotel," and she said, "I'm moving. I'm moving right now. I'm getting out of here because I can't go near that closet. I can't open that closet. I can't sleep at night." So I said, "Well, I'm very, very sorry about that. I didn't realize anybody was living in that room today." So, yeah.
And then when we got with the BSC ladies again, and I asked about, do you remember that guy? And she said, "Oh, yes, we remember him. He was so handsome. Oh, he was such a great dancer."
Mario.
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 Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, Mario. I remember Mario. Yeah. Whatever. He said he just left one day and we never knew what would happen to him.
Mario ended up in a diplomatic bag in Argentina. I think we've done everything we could do. I think we've come to the end of the road, and that's because everybody has passed on. There's no one left. They're all gone. And secondly, we now have a statue of Sir William Stevenson on the main street of Whitby. We now have a permanent location for the Campex Museum, which is something I've been trying to do for years. It's bounced around. It was at the Bob Stewart's Museum. It was at the regional headquarters in
Ajax.
Ajax. It's been everywhere. So it's now got a permanent home in a great location because they have 600,000 visitors per year. That's who will be seeing this new museum that we've built. So I don't think there's anything else right now that we can do. Certainly not in my time. It's going to have to be somebody else. If one day they decide to release all the documents that are still top secret in Ottawa and in Kew, England, if they do that, then someone else is going to have to pick up the ball and write the end of the story. But I think we come to the end of the road.
All you have to do is just have one or two people say, "Well, why can't I know how? What's this all about?" All you need somebody with
Tenacity.
no. Oh, you're yes, that's one. No, but interest.
Yeah.
Yeah, somebody who said, "Oh, I didn't know that." Oh, what? Because the more they said no to Lynn, "You can't know that." He'd say, "Well, watch me. I'm going to go find out."
Yeah.